and the JCC Association. Avi Melamed is a geopolitical Middle East expert, intelligence analyst, former Israeli intelligence official, and senior Arab affairs advisor. Avi is the founder of Inside the Middle East Intelligence Perspectives, an apolitical, nonpartisan educational nonprofit institute. He's the author of 3 books on the region. His recent book is Inside the Middle East, Entering a New Era. Avi is also the author, producer, and host of The Seamline, a 5-part docuseries exploring the many layers of the conflict in and over Jerusalem. His newest project, Inside the Middle East, The Primer, is a 1-hour educational video designed to provide a Western audience with an understanding of the factors shaping the region, equipping diverse viewers with vital education through on-the-ground filming and authentic voices from the Arab and Muslim world, often absent from Western discourse. Avi's fluent in Hebrew, Arabic, and English, and is a frequent commentator on international media platforms such as ABC, BBC, Bloomberg, CNN, Fox, NBC, Newsweek, Sky News, and he's a permanent contributor to the USA Today. At the end of Avi's program, we will be taking questions, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat towards the end of the program, but we will not be answering any questions during the program. Thank you, and please help me welcome Avi Melamed.
Zoe, thank you so much for this very kind introduction. Thank you for your cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, shalom. I'm very honored to be here tonight with you. Tonight, we're going to talk about the Middle East and the current situation in the Middle East. We're actually experiencing a very, very dynamic developments in the region, what I refer to as a domino effect that we see in different parts of the region. So tonight, in our presentation, we will talk about this domino effect, trying to understand what generates it, what's the current repercussion, and what's the possible ramification down the road. To a large extent, even though not exclusively, but to a very large extent, the domino effect that we'll talk about tonight is the outcome of an event that took place about 1.5 years ago, an event that I'm quite sure that you are all familiar with, and this is October 7, Hamas attack on the state of Israel. So in the first opening part of my presentation tonight, I will explain what led to October 7. It's important to understand the factors and the currents that are involved in the whole trajectory that led to October 7, so we could understand later on when I talk about the domino effect and the ramification. I will open my presentation with some short framing, which is very needed for just better understanding of the terms that I'm going to talk about. So you see in front of you the map of Israel and also Palestinian territories. You see to the right-hand side Jordan, the Arab states that borders Israel from the east. You could see there is a large area that is marked or titled as Palestinian Authority, Fatah/Palestinian Authority. This is an area that has different name. It is known as the West Bank, the Palestinian territories, the occupied territories. Some call it Judea and Samaria. It depends what your outlook is. Today, 50% of the West Bank is ruled by a Palestinian entity that is known by the name of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority was established in 1994 following the Israeli PLO agreement known as the Oslo Accords. The PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, is a framework, an umbrella of different Palestinian organizations. It was established in 1964. The major organization within PLO is the Fatah organization, which is also the major pillar of the Palestinian Authority. Today, the Palestinian Authority rules about 50% of the West Bank and rules directly some 1.7 million Palestinians. The other 50% of the West Bank is ruled by Israel. The West Bank was not annexed to Israel. Rather, it's being ruled by an Israeli civil administration and military governance. In the area that is ruled by Israel, in the West Bank, there are some 160 Israeli communities, rather known also as settlements, with a population of some 500,000 Israelis who live in those communities, rather also known as settlers. Next to them, there are some 200,000 Palestinians who live under the Israeli rule in the West Bank. In the left-hand side, in the bottom, you could see this logo of Hamas, a Palestinian Islamic movement that was established in Gaza Strip in 1987. We will, of course, later on elaborate talking more about Hamas. You could see that Hamas rules this area that is called the Gaza Strip in between Egypt and Israel. Gaza Strip is a small strip, 8 by 20 miles, populated by some 2 million Palestinians. A very shortly briefing about a contemporary milestone in the history of Gaza. Between 1948 and 1967, Gaza Strip was ruled by Egypt, but it was not annexed to Egypt. Following the 1967 war, Israel occupied Gaza Strip, and Israel ruled Gaza Strip until 2005. Israel did not annex Gaza Strip. During that period of time, Israeli governments established communities in Gaza Strip, settlements, if you wish, 21 communities with a total population of some 10,000 Israeli settlers who lived in those communities. They were secured by the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF. In 2005, Israeli government passed a law known by the name of the Disengagement Law, and following that law, Israel pulled out from Gaza Strip, totally dismantling all the settlements, relocating all the settlers back in Israel, and evacuating the Israeli military forces from Gaza Strip. In October 2005, the rule of Israel in Gaza came to an end. Israel handed control over Gaza to the hands of the Palestinian Authority. However, the rule of the Palestinian Authority did not last long, because a year and a half later, in the summer of 2007, Hamas, a Palestinian Islamic movement that was established in Gaza Strip in 1987, conducted a violent coup, violently terminating the rule of the Palestinian Authority, its own brothers to say, and since 2007, Hamas ruled Gaza Strip de facto. So what led to October 7? October 7 is actually the conjunction, or the outcome of the conjunction of three ideologies that have come together, coincided in the last third of the 20th century. What are those ideologies and how and why they have led to October 7? In order to understand it, with your permission, a very short historical lesson, sort of speaking. Islam is the religion of most people in the Middle East. Islam emerged in the Arab Peninsula, Saudi Arabia of our times, in the 7th century, and very quickly became a conquering empire, a caliphate. Very quickly, it evolved in a power struggle within Islam regarding the question, who is entitled to lead the Muslim caliphate? That power struggle resulted in two camps within Islam. Majority of the Muslims are Sunnis, about 84%. Sunnis argue that leading the Muslim world should be done by a person that has the qualifications and skill to do that position, and he should be elected. The minority, the other camp, is known by the name of Shi'at Ali, the political followers of Ali. Ali, the fourth caliph in Islam, Ali bin Abi Talib, was the son-in-law and cousin of Prophet Muhammad. He was assassinated, and Shia argue that leading the Muslim world should be done only by a descendant, a male descendant of Ali. The Shiites believe, the major branch of the Shiites, that is known by the name of the 12-ish, believes that there has been a line of 12 spiritual leaders, starting with Ali. They call these spiritual leaders Imam, and they believe that each and every one of those leaders is connected to a divine source of knowledge, and therefore the rule of the Imam has to be blindly obeyed because the Imam is immune from mistakes. The Shiite believes, the major branch of the Shiites that is known by the name of the 12-ish, believe that the last one of them disappeared as a little boy in the 9th century, but he's not dead. He believes he is alive and waiting outside time and history to be summoned up and come and lead the world and mankind to salvation. He's rather known by the name of Al-Mahdi, which means the Messiah, if you wish, or the absent Imam, or in Arabic also known as Sahib al-Zaman, which means master of time. One of the major, deepest narratives of the Shiite is that they have been allegedly deprived of the right to lead the Muslim world, and there is a lot of animosity between the Shiite and the Sunnis. Though they are both Muslims, the animosities are non-breachable, theologically, culturally, politically, the narratives, and so through history, since the 7th century. Shiite and Sunni has been butchering each other. They have been fighting each other, even though they are both Muslims. Another major power struggle that shaped the Middle East through history is between three major civilizations in the region. The Arab civilization gave birth to Islam. Islam was born in the Arab civilization. Most of the Arabs are Sunni Muslims. However, there is a large segment of Arabs who are Shia. Remember that because it's significant. Another civilization is the Persian civilization. The Persians, of course, are not Arabs. They don't speak Arabic, and they are not from the Arab Peninsula. They are from Persia, and they speak Farsi. And most of the Persians are Shiites in their denomination. The third one is Turkey. The Turks are neither Arab nor Persians. They are not from the Arab Peninsula. They are not from Persia. They don't speak Arabic. They don't speak Farsi. They are from Central Asia, and they speak Turkish. Most of the Turks are Sunnis. So you have Turkey predominantly Sunni, Arab predominantly Sunni, with a large segment of Shiite Arabs, and Persians predominantly Shiites. Both the Shiite and Sunnah in Islam actually were a hub for a very radical expansionist globalist outlook that envision a global world that has no independent statehood, but rather is ruled according to the Islamic religious codex, rather known by the name of Sharia law. In the Sunni denomination, that vision is rather known by the name of caliphate. In the Shiite, it's rather known by the name of imamate, named after that leader, the spiritual leader that I mentioned before, the imam position. So this is one of the very few common denominators, sort of speaking, between the two, though I would mention that according to the Shia outlook, of course, such an imamate should be ruled according to the Shiite translation of Islam, while the Sunni caliphate, according to the Sunni, of course, should be ruled according to the Sunni translation of Islamic religious codex, the Sharia law. However, the common denominator is that they both envision a world that does not have an independent statehood, and it's ruled according to the Islamic religious law. When you look at the Sunni camp, for example, you see to the left-hand side, you may recognize some groups and organizations that are coming from the hub of the Sunni caliphate model. Like, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood that were established in Egypt in 1928. It's the biggest mass movement in the Muslim Sunni world. Al-Qaeda, that was established in Afghanistan in 1988, is also coming from the hub of the Sunni caliphate model. The word Al-Qaeda, by the way, means the foundation. Beneath that, you see Hamas, an Islamic Palestinian group that was established in 1987 in Gaza Strip. Hamas means in Arabic religious enthusiasm. It's also the initials of, I will say it in Arabic and I will translate, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, the Islamic resistance movement. I want you to remember the term resistance because shortly you will see how relevant it is. Hamas formally defines itself as the offspring of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. Beneath Hamas, you see another logo that you may recognize. This is ISIS. It also comes from the hub of the Sunni radical ideology of the caliphate. In the Shiite camp, you also may be able to recognize some groups, like, for example, Hezbollah. Hezbollah, two words in Arabic, which means the party of God. Beneath the logo of the Hezbollah, the yellow one, you see another yellow logo. This is the yellow of Iraqi Shiite militias, a congregation of Iraqi Shiite militias known by the name of the Popular Mobilization Unit, PMU, or in Arabic, Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi. Beneath them, you see another interesting group, or to be more accurate, a military power called Ansar Allah, the disciples of Allah. This is actually the military power of an entity that has become known in the West in the last year, known as Houthi, a congregation of Shiite tribes from northern Yemen. And beneath you see the logo of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, a major spine of the Mullah regime in Tehran. As I said before, there are actually three ideologies. The third one, unlike the two previous ones, is not old, it's not ancient, it's contemporary. This is an ideology that appeared in the Middle East in the 20th century, and it's rather known by the name of the resistance, al-Muqawama. This is an ideology that vows non-compromising animosity towards the West and Western values. It views the West as a declining, oppressive power that is doomed to disappear. It vows to eliminate the presence of the West anywhere in the Muslim and the Arab world. One major feature of the ideology of the Al-Muqawama, the resistance, is the non-compromising animosity towards the state of Israel. They vow to eliminate the state of Israel. They view Israel as an outpost of the Western imperialistic oppressive power, and therefore Israel has to be eradicated under the banner of liberating Palestine. So how those three ideologies, in the end of the day, are going to result in, among other things, October 7. The answer is that when you look at the geostrategic landscape of the Middle East in large areas of the Middle East, you see that starting as of the last third of the 20th century, those ideologies, namely the Sunni Caliphate, the Shiite Imamate, and the ideology of the resistance, gained momentum on the ground. In 1979, we have the Iranian Islamic Revolution in Iran. Iran becomes a Shiite theocracy under the leadership of what is known as the Mullah regime. The Mullahs are the Shiite clergies, and that is a very extreme regime, ideologically motivated by the outlook of this Shiite imamate, expansion of the Shiite rule across the region, under the banner of what is known as exporting the Islamic Revolution. Inspired or incentivized by the deepest narrative of the Shiites, namely the one that says, we, the Shiites, we were supposed to lead the Muslim world, but crown of leadership was stolen from us by our bitter rivalry, the Sunni Arabs. The Mullah regime in Tehran translated those narratives into geostrategic master plan of expansion across the Middle East, rather known by the name of exporting the Islamic Revolution. And so when you look at the map and you see all these yellow colors, they are basically representing a network of groups, semi-state entities or terror organizations that the Mullah regime has been establishing and or nurturing as part of enhancing its vision of expansion. So, for example, in the 1980s, the Mullah regime is establishing in Lebanon, an Arab state bordering Israel from the north, what is going to become its most powerful proxy, the Hezbollah in Lebanon. Syria, a major Arab state, became a very significant strategic ally of the Mullah regime under the rule of the previous president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, like his father, Hafez al-Assad, who ruled Syria from 1970 until 2000. Syria became a very significant component in this expansion vision of the Mullah regime. Later on, we'll understand why it was so significant. In Iraq, the Mullah regime is taking advantage of the appearance of ISIS as Sunni radical groups in Iraq in the early 2000s. And the Shiite regime in Iran is taking advantage of that development to nurture and support Iraqi Shiite militias, rather going to be known by the name of the Popular Mobilizations Unit, the PMU, to basically create itself a power base in Iraq. In Yemen, in the mid-90s, the mullah regime is strengthening and advancing its cooperation with the Houthis, those congregations of Shiite tribes in the northern part of Yemen, supporting them militarily, providing military know-how, and so on. But it's not only that the Shiite vision of the imamate is gaining momentum starting as of the last third of the 20th century. It's also the Sunni caliphate model also gaining. So, for example, in the 1980s, two Palestinian organizations are emerging. One is Islamic Jihad in Palestine, and the other one in 1987, Hamas in Gaza Strip. In 1988, we have the establishment of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Yet again, it comes from the hub of the Sunni caliphate model. In the early 2000s, ISIS emerged in Iraq. ISIS is actually an offspring of Al-Qaeda. At some point between 2013 to 2018, ISIS has basically practically established sort of an entity, an Islamic State, in both territories of Iraq and Syria. So all in all, when you look at the geostrategic landscape of large parts of this region, starting as of the last third of the 20th century, you see how those three ideologies, the Sunni Caliphate, the Shiite imamate, and the resistance are gaining momentum across the region. The manifestation of that is the establishing of an axis, a network of semi-state entities and terror organizations that are going to be known by the name of the axis of resistance and defiance, محور المقاومة والممانعة. This is a very interesting axis that has some very interesting features. First, you will not find Iranians in this axis. It is massively supported, armed, guided, and nurtured by the mullah regime in Tehran, but you will not find Iranians in that axis. You will find mostly Arabs. So, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon is based upon Lebanese Arabs. Iraqi Shiite militias in Iraq are based upon Iraqi Arabs. Houthis in Yemen are Arabs. Arab is a culture, it's an ethnicity, it's not a religion. Another interesting aspect of that is that the members of this axis are actually coming from different Arab states. Hezbollah in Lebanon is Lebanese. Iraqi Shiite militias are Iraqis in their nationality. The Houthis are Yemenites in their nationality. Another interesting feature of that axis is the fact that those elements that I mentioned right now, they are basically Shiites, and they are prioritizing the interests of the mullah regime in Tehran over the interests of their own homelands at the expense of their own brothers and sisters. Literally speaking, their own brothers and sisters. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iraqi Shiite militias in Iraq, Houthis in Yemen, they all sacrificed, practically speaking, the well-being and interest of their own brothers and sisters in their own homelands at the altar of the mullah regime in Tehran. The explanation for that is that they all argue that in the end of the day, the fact that they are Arabs in their ethnicity, or Iraqi, or Lebanese, or Yemenites in their nationality, is not the most significant component of identity for them. The most significant one is the fact that they are Shiites. And then there is another interesting feature of this axis, and that is the fact that in this axis you will find non-Shiites actors, to be accurate, Sunni actors in the shape of two Palestinian groups, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, that I mentioned earlier. Hamas and Islamic Jihad are very significant components in this axis of resistance. However, they are Sunnis, they are not Shiites. The Palestinians are Sunnis, not Shiites. So you may wonder what brings Hamas and Islamic Jihad to play such a major role in an axis that in the end of the day is predominantly Shiite, an axis that it serves the interests of the mullah regime in Tehran, who is hostile to the Arab and the Sunni world. The answer for that is that, of course, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, like other members of this axis of resistance, vows to eliminate Israel under the banner of liberating Palestine. The issue of liberating Palestine is very much present in the discussion culturally, emotionally, politically in the Muslim and the Arab world. Obviously, a majority of the Muslims and Arabs identify with the Palestinians. They stand by the Palestinians. They are their brothers to faith and to religion. And so the issue of liberating Palestine is a very, very powerful slogan, very, very powerful issue. The axis of resistance and the mullah regime in Tehran identified the centrality of that concept as a mean to harvest political dividends and support. How? By basically positioning themselves as the spearhead that will liberate Palestine. In front of you, you see an interesting poster, one of many that has been marketed across the Muslim and Arab world. It's marketed by the mullah regime and the axis of resistance. And the interesting thing that you may be able to identify in this poster, you could see the different militants that has different flags. You see the flag of Iraq, the previous flag of Syria, Hezbollah, the yellow one, a Palestinian flag, an Iranian flag, and they are all marching towards some sort of a beautiful construction that you may recognize. This is a very famous place. It's called Dome of the Rock. In English, it's called in Arabic, Qubat al-Sakhra. In Hebrew, it's called Kipat al-Sela. And it's located in a compound in the old city of Jerusalem, a compound that is known in different name. It's known by the name of Al-Haram al-Sharif in Arabic. In Hebrew, it's called Har HaBayit. And in English, it's known as the Temple Mount compound. Al-Haram al-Sharif contain within this compound, there is a mosque that is known by the name of Al-Aqsa Mosque. Al-Aqsa is actually one of the names of Jerusalem in Islam. The other name of Jerusalem in Arabic is Al-Quds, which means the holy. The concept of liberating Palestine and liberating Al-Aqsa is very, very powerful in the Muslim and the Arab world. Muslims have three holy sites. Two of them are located in Saudi Arabia, Mecca and Medina. The third one, Al-Aqsa, or the Temple Mount compound, the Haram al-Sharif, is in Jerusalem, and it's under Israel's. This is not acceptable for Muslims. So you could see and understand that by playing this card of liberating Palestine and liberating Al-Aqsa, this is a very powerful emotionally and politically narrative that resonates very well across the Muslim and the Arab world. An interesting thing to notice in that specific poster is that you could see these two major waves on both sides of the militants. And why is it interesting? Because Hamas attack on Israel is defined formally by Hamas by the name of Tawfan al-Aqsa, which means the flood of Al-Aqsa. Now you can understand the connection between that poster and the slogan. As a matter of fact, the story of resistance is very interesting for one major aspect, I would say. You know, in Western circles following October 7th, there are some Western circles that have been romanticizing the concept of resistance. It has been translated, sort of speaking, by presence of Arab factors in the West or through media, and actually it was viewed or accepted by some circles in the West in a very positive perspective, romanticizing, because it sounds very romantic, resistance, and idealizing that concept. However, the reality is by far not so much glorious and romantic. In fact, when you look at the impact of this axis on the geostrategic landscape of the region for the last 40 years, you could see that this axis has inflicted an enormous death and destruction across the Middle East. In Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Gaza, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people lost their life. Cities turned to dust. Millions became refugees. Israel is also paid dearly for the negative impact of this axis. This axis has inflicted an enormous death and destruction across the region. So it's no wonder that at some point the Arab world that has been so fascinated by the concept of the axis of resistance will liberate Palestine. At some point, some in the Arab world started to have a second thought about this whole thing, and they actually realized that the axis of resistance in the end of the day is first and foremost a Trojan horse that the Iranians have developed in order to, simply to put it, take over the Arab world from within. And to a large extent, that's exactly what happened. Hezbollah in Lebanon basically took over Lebanon with its Iranian weapon. The Hezbollah turned Lebanon into Iranian satellite, terrorizing the Lebanese and dictating its will upon the Lebanese. In Syria, Assad regime basically during the second decade of the 21st century was totally dependent upon the Iranians to survive the uprising of the Syrian people, a war that lasted for 13 years. In Iraq, the Shiite Iraqi militias basically provided the Iranian mullah regime a seat around the Iraqi government table to the point the Iranians became enormously influential on the Iraqi politics. In Yemen, the Houthis in 2014 are launching an attack, a coup, ousting the Yemeni government and dragging Yemen into a civil war that continues up to our days, resulting in enormous death and destruction. So it's no wonder that in some circles, more and more in the Arab world, more and more started to realize that this whole thing of the axis of resistance is actually a Trojan horse. So you see this, for example, cartoon published in Arab media, and that cartoon shows you the horse, a wooden horse, and the rider says Iran. You see the arrow points, and it says Al-Quds, which means Jerusalem. And of course, the notion here is that the horse is the axis of resistance guided by the Iranians, and it is going to towards Jerusalem to liberate Jerusalem. None of that, of course, happened because this horse is going nowhere. What it does is it is eliminating and crushing Arab states. So you could see beneath the horse leg, you could see signs that says Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq. A very significant component in this whole axis of resistance in the context of eliminating Israel is what we call the Ring of Fire, a doctrine to eliminate Israel. And actually, the Ring of Fire says that those militias, those semi-state entities, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Iraqi Shiite militias, Houthis, and other Iranian-backed semi-state entities and terror organizations, they will be the force, the military force that will eliminate the state of Israel. Interesting enough, when you look at the some features of that master plan of the Ring of Fire, you can understand now the nature of the relationship between Hamas and Islamic Jihad, reminding you the Sunni Palestinians with the axis of resistance, which is predominantly Shiite, and it's ruled and guided by the Mullah Shiite regime in Tehran. The essence of the relations between the two is what I call a marriage of convenience. What's for Iran in this marriage? For the Mullah regime in Tehran, the escalation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a strategic interest. Why? Because the more the conflict escalates, the more the Mullah regime can continue and market to the Arab world the slogan of we will liberate Palestine and therefore we need to arm and support those armies of terror that meanwhile are basically taking over the Arab world from within. But in order to be able to continue and market that slogan, somebody needs to do the dirty job of escalation of the conflict. Somebody has to fuel the flames of the conflict. That somebody are Hamas and Islamic Jihad. This is their role. What's in it for Hamas and Islamic Jihad? In return for fueling the flame of the conflict, they get generous Iranian support. Weapons, ammunition, finance, military know-how, guidance, and so on and so on. Indeed, when you look at the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the last 40 years, you could see that there has been a massive escalation. And that escalation, as you could see in front of you, was further escalated following the taking over of Gaza by Hamas in 2007, manifested in repeating military rounds with Israel. There is something very interesting in that context, and that is the fact that while the conflict has been enormously escalating, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been enormously escalating for the last 40 years. At the same time, in Western circles, the major discussion was centered around the concept of two-state solution and peace. It was very clearly detached from what was happening on the. Later on, we'll try to understand what could be the explanation to that fact. However, going back to talk about this ring of fire and the role of the different players, one major feature of that blueprint, if you wish, is the concept that is known in Arabic by the name of Wahdat al-Sahat, unifying of arenas, meaning this is the day where all those militias, semi-state entities, massively supported and armed and nurtured by the Mullah regime in Tehran, this is the day where they will join hands together and attack Israel as one from all directions and eliminate the state of Israel. That day has a date. The date was October 7. This is the process. These are the forces. These are the currents that led, starting as from the last third of the 20th century, to the point of October 7. Hamas is launching October 7 attack on Israel under the impression that the day of unifying of the arenas has come. Hamas' impression was not totally baseless because in the months before the attack, there were meetings of Hamas with his colleagues from the axis of resistance in Beirut, in Damascus, in Baghdad, and in the summer of 23, also in Tehran. And what Hamas heard from its colleagues to the axis of resistance was, they said in Arabic, "Ihna jahizun," which means we are willing, ready, and able. Another thing that incentivized Hamas to launch the attack was that the inner power struggle, the inner Palestinian power struggle over leadership. You may recall that in the beginning of my presentation, I was talking about the Palestinian Authority and its major spine, the Fatah organization. Fatah organization was established in 1958, 30 years before Hamas. The two powers, Fatah on the one hand, Hamas on the other hand, are the two major Palestinian players, and they are fighting for the leadership of the people, of the Palestinian people. This is a fight that is non-reconcilable. It's non-bridgeable. They are coming from totally different political perspectives and ideologies. The power struggle between the two intensified following 2007, when Hamas brutally crushed the rule of the Palestinian Authority and Fatah in Gaza Strip. All the attempts of Muslim and Arab leaders since then to reconcile the sides, even though those attempts resulted in reconciliation agreements between the sides, all those agreements didn't even see daylight. So Hamas, under the impression that the day of unifying of arenas has come and Israel is going to be eliminated, Hamas incentivized because he thought that by doing that, Hamas once and for all decisively win the power struggle over leadership against Fatah, and Hamas will position itself as the one and only leader of the Palestinian people. But things evolved quite differently following October 7, not exactly the way Hamas was envisioned. Following the attack on Israel, October 7, Israel invaded Gaza Strip, and there is a war going in Gaza Strip. Israeli governments ordered the IDF to operate in Gaza Strip to eliminate Hamas rule, to bring back the Israeli hostages that were kidnapped on October 7. The war in Gaza Strip escalates, and in parallel, the Mullah regime in Tehran starts to realize that unless the war is going to end, he's going to lose a very significant arm. This is Hamas ruling Gaza, reminding you, Hamas' job was to fuel the flames of the conflict. So the Mullah regime has started very quickly to activate its different proxies to put military pressure on Israel, on the United States, and on the world to bring in the end of the war in Gaza. On October 8, Hezbollah is attacking Israeli northern communities, and the leader of Hezbollah back then, Hassan Nasrallah, says, I will continue the attacks until there will be ceasefire in Gaza Strip. In parallel, Iraqi Shiite militias are starting to attack US bases in Iraq, in Jordan, and in Syria. In parallel, they are starting also to attack Israel. Houthis in Yemen are attacking Israel. They are attacking maritime in the Red Sea and the Gulf and Bab el-Mandab Strait, one of the most strategic locations on this planet. And when the United States is assembling a military coalition called Guardians of Prosperity to push back the Houthis' aggression, they start also to attack the members of this coalition. So what we see during 2024 is that the war in Gaza Strip is not contained to Gaza Strip. It's not confined to Gaza Strip. It actually expands, and now it reaches different arenas. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen. The most significant development is in the context of Lebanon and the Hezbollah. Hezbollah, as I said before, is the most powerful proxy of the Iranian regime. The Mullah regime invested in the last 40 years or so billions of dollars in building the Hezbollah, and it was an investment very well paid. The Hezbollah became a regional with a military might that only few states on this planet has, particularly missiles and rockets, all provided, of course, by the Mullah regime. As I mentioned before, the Hezbollah, though he is part of the Lebanese political system, he has a party in the parliament, he participates in the political life, he sits around the government table. The Hezbollah actually subjected Lebanon to the will of the Iranians, and whenever the Lebanese tried to defy Hezbollah, the Hezbollah did not hesitate to terrorize the Lebanese. Lebanon basically was occupied by Iran in a remote control. In fact, in the Arab world and in the region, the Hezbollah has been viewed as a regional player, and to a large extent, rightly so. The Hezbollah has been involved in the war in Yemen, in this war in Syria. The Hezbollah has been even involved in the West Sahara. So we are looking at a major player that basically became a regional player and the most significant proxy of the Mullah regime. During the collision with Israel, something amazing is happening. In a very relatively short period of time, the Hezbollah is sustaining a significant military defeat. You probably remember the famous story of the beepers, how Israel was able to neutralize in a click of a button thousands of Hezbollah's militants. Israel was eliminating almost all the senior leadership of the Hezbollah, including its leader Hassan Nasrallah and all of its chief military operators and commanders, most of them. And so in a relatively short period of time, the Hezbollah sustained a very swift defeat. That development sent a massive shockwave across the Middle East. You know, I've been covering this region for 40 years professionally. And following what happened to Hezbollah, I came across a notion I did not come across before. Some Arab analysts actually compared the defeat of the Hezbollah to the defeat of the Arab armies in the 1967 war against Israel. This is a massive shockwave that crossed the Middle East, and it is resulting in a domino effect. The most significant domino effect is happening in Syria. You may remember I said before, Syria, particularly under the rule of the President Bashar al-Assad, who is of course no longer the president, Syria became a significant strategic ally of Iran. The major reason, or one of the major reasons for that, is the fact that Syria actually sits in the heart of a land corridor that the Mullah regime in Iran has been building and nurturing for the last 4 decades, a land corridor stretching from Iran, crossing through Iraq, Syria, ending up in Lebanon offshore the Mediterranean Sea. To a large extent, the Mullah regime was successfully establishing that land corridors and activating it. Iraqi Shiite militias in Iraq that basically obey the Iranian regime actually were controlling the passage between Iraq and Syria, and thus enabled the streaming of weapons, missiles, rockets, and militants from Iraq to Syria and back, obviously guided and orchestrated and supported by the Mullah regime. Syria became a logistics enormous hub of the Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Iranians and the Hezbollah established in Syria factories manufacturing missiles and rockets. During the war in Syria that started in 2011, the Iranians rushed to support Assad regime, to save Assad regime, particularly because of the fact that Assad regime is a very significant cornerstone in this structure that the Mullah regime has been building for the last 40 years. During the war in Syria, the Mullah regime invested billions and billions of dollars to save Assad regime. One of the first things the Iranians did was to send Hezbollah from Lebanon to fight in Syria and to save Assad regime. Indeed, it is the Iranian and the Hezbollah support, together with, of course, the support of Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, that actually kept Assad in power. In more than 10 years of war in Syria, the Hezbollah sustained some 2,500 fatalities and some 10,000 injured. In a couple of months of confrontation with Israel in 2024, the Hezbollah sustained some 4,000 fatalities and apparently some 10,000, maybe more, injured. In other words, in the end of 2024, the defeat of the Hezbollah is basically providing an opportunity for Syrian rebels that mostly has been based in the northwest part of Syria, supported and backed and armed by Turkey and Qatar. That was a moment of opportunity because they realized that now that the Hezbollah is weakened, this could be their chance to launch an offensive against Assad. That offensive, to a large extent, was orchestrated by the Turks. The Turkish President Erdogan is bothered with two major issues vis-a-vis the whole issue of Syria. One is the presence of some 3 or maybe more million Syrian refugees in Turkey that creates a lot of economic and political burden to Erdogan. And the other thing is the formation and establishment of a Kurdish autonomy in the northeast part of Syria during the war in Syria. Those two things bothered Erdogan enormously. And in fact, he was trying to solve those issues through diplomatic channels. He was trying to negotiate with Assad to find a political and diplomatic solution. The point is that Assad felt very secure, and basically Assad refused to play ball with Erdogan. But now, in the end of 2024, given the defeat of the Hezbollah in Lebanon, given the fact that Putin is engaged in an ongoing war in Ukraine, Turkey and the Syrian rebels identify an opportunity to launch this offensive. The outcome of that offensive basically astonished everyone, including, by the way, intelligence agencies. The outcome was that within 2 weeks, Assad regime simply collapsed. Assad fled to Russia, his army collapsed, and now there is a new rule in Syria. And one of the first things about this rule, that this is a very hostile rule to the Iranians and to the Hezbollah, because they have been the one that have been oppressing the Syrian people during the war and killing them. In other words, within 2 weeks, a major investment of the Mullah regime building this structure for the last 40 years, billions and billions and billions of dollars basically went down the drain with the downfall of Assad regime, the Iranian land corridor cut, and the meaning of that, practically speaking, is the end of the Iranian hegemonic vision in the region. You see in front of you a couple of cartoons published in Arab media. There are many, as you could understand. The upper one, for example, is one that reflects this domino effect. It shows you how Israel, you see the hand is knocking down Hezbollah. Hezbollah is falling down, and the next thing that falls down is Assad. Interesting enough, that cartoon implies that the next one to fall is the Houthi in Yemen. So this is the process that led to this domino effect, where we are kind of like now witnessing this amazing, significant domino effect. What is the current situation in those arenas that I mentioned before? Well, in Lebanon, you have an Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire. Israel has been operating and continue to operate in the south part of Lebanon to eliminate the military infrastructure that the Hezbollah has been building there for 20 years as part of this whole master plan of the Ring of Fire, of unifying of the arenas, aims to eliminate Israel. In Syria, Israel rushed following the downfall of Assad to capture some strategic locations. You see this white zone in front of you. This is an area that is known as the dividing zone or the no military zone. It's a zone that has been established on the ground following the Israeli-Syrian ceasefire agreement from 1974. The most significant point that Israel rushed to capture is the Syrian peak of the Hermon Mountain. The Hermon Mountain in the northern part of Israel, split between Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. The highest peak is in the Syrian territory. Today, it is ruled by Israeli Defense Forces. In Iraq, we see the cessation of Iraqi Shiite militias attacks on Israel. One of the interesting manifestations of that, or the reasons for that, is likely that the Iraqi Shiite militias that has been loyal to Iran apparently are kind of like stepping back, and that was one of the explanations for that phenomenon. The Houthis continues their attack against Israel, now with the establishing of an Israeli-Hamas ceasefire in Gaza Strip, as you already know. The Houthi says that once there is a ceasefire, they will stop the attacks. But however, up until now, up until the ceasefire has been in place, the Houthis continues in their sporadic, poking, sort of speaking, attacks against Israel. Iran, as I said before, is facing an enormous geostrategic defeat with the downfall of Assad regime, with the defeat of the Hezbollah, with the weakening of Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza Strip. The Iranians need to recalculate their course. In Iran, there is an enormous increasing challenges economically, socially, politically, and so on. It is very possible that the combination of those challenges with the geostrategic blow-up, defeat that the Iranian regime sustained, and the new administration, Trump administration, it's very possible that Iran in 2025 will face a very significant challenges to the point it may even jeopardize the endurance of the Mullah regime in Tehran. We'll have to see, of course, how things will evolve. As part of the domino effect, one of the things that we see in Lebanon and Iraq, for example, is that the local factors that have been fighting to restore their sovereignty that was abducted by the Iranian proxies all those years are gaining momentum. In Lebanon, about 2 weeks ago or less, the Lebanese has elected a new president, or to be more accurate, the Lebanese parliament elected a new president in Lebanon. Why is it so interesting? Because the position of the Lebanese president is the highest executive position. It's not a symbolic one. The last president, Michel Aoun, ended his term more than 2 years ago. And up until recently, the Lebanese parliament, the political parties were unable to elect a new president. The reason for that was simply to say that the Hezbollah veto any candidate other than his own. The Hezbollah basically said to the Lebanese, it's either my way or the highway. Following the defeat of the Hezbollah, this bottleneck was open, and the parliament chosen the Lebanese chief of staff, who is still in position as chief of staff. His name is General Joseph Aoun, no relation to the previous president, to be the new president of Lebanon. Had the Hezbollah was in its peak of the power it used to be before October 7, Joseph Aoun would have not become the president of Lebanon. But he is now the president of Lebanon. He's definitely not Hezbollah's favorite candidate, but it's part of the weakening of the Hezbollah in Lebanon following the military defeat with Israel. In Syria, we witnessed the rise to power of a new rule. Large part of this new rule is associated with Islamic organizations and groups. The major umbrella of those organizations is known by the name of HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and its leader is a person known by the name of Abu Muhammad al-Julani. This is actually nickname. His name is Ahmad Hassan al-Shara. And the world in the region is looking very closely to see what's going Syria's trajectory to be ahead. On the one hand, the new rule is clearly coming from the hub of the Sunni radical world that we mentioned before. In fact, they are going back to the roots of Al-Qaeda and even ISIS. In other words, we are looking at groups that are ideologically are coming from a very radical militant outlook. On the other hand, it's very clear that the new rule in Syria is doing an enormous effort, walking an extra mile to send messages of pragmatism and moderation. It's very clear that these messages are aimed to first and foremost enable this rule to stabilize the situation in Syria, which is to a large extent ruined. Syria needs to be rehabilitated after this war, and to that extent, the new rule in Syria must address different factors in the region, particularly, namely the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, who have the potential capacities to be major participants in the rehabilitation of Syria. And indeed, they are already signaling they are willing to do that, but it comes with a price. The price, of course, is stability. They need the new rule in Syria to stabilize, not destabilize the situation. So it will be very interesting to see how this tension between the ideological jihadist background of the new rule in Syria and the practicalities and the needs, the immediate and long-term needs, how it will balance in the context of trajectory of Syria moving ahead. In Israel and Hamas and Gaza Strip, as you know, of course, I'm sure yesterday, a very dramatic day, ceasefire in effect, resulting in, for now, the release of 3 Israeli female hostages. As part of this ceasefire, another 30 are supposed to be released as part of this first phase that's supposed to be followed by negotiations over the next phase for the release of the rest of the hostages. We are looking at a very convoluted, sensitive, difficult process in every possible aspect. We should not rule out the possibility that at some point we will see reignition of the fight in Gaza Strip. This is one of the major concerns. It's currently a very fluid situation. Israeli government vows to end the rule of the Hamas in Gaza Strip. Trump administration backed that statement. Hamas obviously going to try to do its best to maintain power. And I should emphasize that Hamas is not going to disappear. It's going to continue and be a very relevant player in the Palestinian arena. Turkey, under the leadership of Erdogan, is gaining momentum with those events, particularly the weakening of Iran, a major rivalry of the Turks, let's put it this way. Turkey gained momentum, of course, in Syria. And actually, it's a kind of like an opportunity for Turkey to try and to Erdogan, particularly, to revive, sort of speaking, its hegemonic vision, because he definitely wants to position itself as the leader of the Sunni camp in the region, an ambition that basically, as you could imagine, collides with the interests and position of major Arab leaders like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. In the context of Erdogan, we should remember this is a shrewd politician, a cynical one that is exhausting every possible cards to harvest the political dividends. Unfortunately, he's quite often doing that at the expense of Israel, reminding you, for example, in the context of Gaza Strip and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Erdogan more than once was leading a very venomous rhetoric against Israel, basically leading into a repeating crisis of relationship between the two states. We have to remember Turkey is an enormous significant player in every possible aspect. In the context of Syria, therefore, we should not be surprised if Erdogan will start steering the Syrian story in context of the Israeli rule of the Golan Heights, something similar to what he did in the context of Gaza Strip. We should definitely follow and be willing to anticipate surprises from this front of Turkey, particularly when we talk about Erdogan. Looking at the Israeli and the Palestinian arena and the Arab world, looking at the Palestinians arena, the biggest question is, in the end of the day, whether there is going to be a change of discussion within the Palestinians vis-a-vis the whole issue of the resistance. In other words, is the traumatic devastation that Hamas caused to Gaza Strip by launching the war against Israel, is that going to make a change within the Palestinian inner discussion? Is it going to result in a situation where Palestinians, as people, as nation, will say to Hamas, we are departing your way, your path, because it's leading us to death and destruction, and we are turning to a different trajectory? Or is it going to result counterintuitively to Western mindset? Is it going to result in more support for Hamas? At this point, I can tell you that both narratives are existing within the Palestinians. We should expect this inner discussion, which is very significant, and particularly the outcomes of this inner discussion in terms of the political reconfiguration of the Palestinian arena. I know that it's almost counterintuitive, because you would expect that when such a devastation caused to Gaza Strip because of Hamas' decision to launch this war, you would expect that the Palestinians will renounce Hamas and basically decisively will walk away from Hamas. Currently, that is not the case. It has to do a lot with also the way that Palestinians in their inner discussion views the concept of triumph and victory, which to a large extent is very much different from the Western mindset. In Israel, I would say that we are just walking through the first preliminary aftershock waves of October 7. Many yet are to come. Israel is not the same Israel as it was before October 7. Many things have changed, as you could understand. One prediction that I would offer in the context of the political structure, I would say that in the next Israeli government, I would anticipate it to be more centered around what I call pragmatic Zionist camp, which is majority of the Israeli Jewish groups or political parties. And I don't necessarily think that ultranational right-wing camp will gain momentum. I don't think that that will be the case. Of course, we will have to subject that prediction to the test of reality. The Arab world is expected to boost its involvement in the region, in arenas like Lebanon, in Syria. It's already happening. We see that very clearly. It's very likely that also we'll see something similar, though not necessarily in the same level of volume, in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is very possible that as part of its increasing involvement, the Arab world will, the major players, let's put it this way, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, will be more proactively involved in shaping the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is good news for itself. And so I would anticipate something like that to take place. I would say that for the last 40 years, as long as the Iranians and the axis of resistance were dictating the large extent the geostrategic landscape of the region and the trajectory, the Arab world was, relatively speaking, low-key involvement in those arenas, and rightly so, because they realized that whatever they will invest is basically just in vain, because in the end of the day, Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah and others are the one dictating the trajectory. Today, with the dramatic changes and domino effect, I would say that I think that we'll see much more proactive involvement of the Arab world, including in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian trajectory. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, I'm concluding my presentation, and I'm opening this session to your questions.
If we have any questions, now's the time to write them down in the chat. Wait a few more moments, and then it seems like, Avi, you covered a lot of material, and this is a lot to reflect on. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just wait a few more moments to see if there's any questions.
Hello.
Yes.
Let's see. Hold on. I think we had a question. Here we go. Yes, we see people raising your hands, but if you can write your question in the chat, please. One second, we are going to make sure that we have audio for questions. See lots of questions. Okay, here we go. Eleanor, are you able to unmute yourself? Lydia, thank you. Please ask your
Hi.
question.
Yeah, can you hear us?
Yes.
Excellent. I think there was a technical glitch, but thank you very much. And of course, big thank you for the conference. Extremely interesting. So thank you for all that. Um, I mean, there are quite a few questions that come to mind, and I'll start with one just based on what you just said toward the end of the conference about how potentially the neo or how do you call that um, the pragmatic Zionist parties may play a bigger role in the current narrative in Israel. I'd like to ask, how do you reconcile these facts with the fact that I think recent polls show that a majority of Israelis are not supporting a two-state solution anymore, following the recent events, I believe. So how do you reconcile those two strands from the fact that Israelis are not really in the majority supporting two-state solution, while pragmatic Zionist parties may play a bigger role in the politics at play in Israel?
Yes, thank you. Actually, I didn't refer specifically to the two states issue. I just talked about the central Zionist parties, but there is no contradiction because Israelis for a long period of time don't support or don't believe the concept of two-state solution. Let's put it this way. They simply think that it's not doable, and obviously you can understand as following October 7, it's less expected that Israelis will become more supportive of that. I would say that in the end of the day, Israelis also do not support, most of them do not support the one-state solution. So we are looking at a situation where I would say that following October 7, we will be centered around the whole issue of the mainstream Zionist parties, which, by the way, includes the Likud, because in the end of the day, it's the Likud also that, at least theoretically or formally, supports the concept of the two-state solution. But we will look at the congregation, I would say, configuration of a political power center, the major power center that will center around I would say, the Zionist pragmatic political parties, but definitely with an additional hawkish taste, which, by the way, was always there. There always has been a hawkish element within the pragmatic Zionist camp. I would expect it to be much more emphasized now. And one of the ramifications of that is, of course, is in the context of two-state solution, but there is nothing new under the sun in that regard. Before October 7, way before October 7, Israelis were very skeptic about the two-state solution. All the polls before that were very clearly indicating that.
Okay, thank you.
Iris, if you can unmute, please.
Hello?
Hello.
So my question is that David Ben-Gurion in 1954 said the state of Israel will not be judged by its riches, army, or advanced technology, but by its moral image and human values. How do you feel that it is doing with respect to that comment today?
I need you, if possible, just to be more specific. I'm not sure that I understand what you're asking.
I want you to answer with respect to how is Israel with respect to the war in Gaza, adhering to David Ben-Gurion's statement in 1954, which said, quote, "The state of Israel will not be judged by its riches, army, or advanced technology, but by its moral image and human values. End quote.
Yes, now I understand. I understand that you refer to the situation in Gaza Strip. Indeed, the situation in Gaza Strip is devastating. Lots of people in Gaza Strip lost their life. There is a big humanitarian crisis in Gaza Strip. I want to emphasize something. I'm not an Israeli spokesperson. I'm not a Palestinian spokesperson. I'm a Middle East expert. And so I would like to share with you something that, as we say, we have to bring some things that are absent from the Western discussion. As a person, as an Israeli, as a Jew, first and foremost, as a human being, obviously, I feel terrible about what's happening in Gaza. As an expert on Middle East, which is my position, I need to share with you the following understanding. In the Arab world, and including the Palestinians, there is a lot of criticism on Hamas. That criticism appeared way before October 7, particularly following 2007, when Hamas took over Gaza Strip and actually dragged Gaza Strip to endless rounds of dead-end streets and a military collision with Israel. The reason it's important to bring that fact to the center of the discussion in the West has to do with something which is enormously significant in the context of the conflict. Then this is what is known as governmental accountability. For some reason, the concept of governmental responsibility for some reason has not been present in the discussion in Western circle vis-a-vis the story of Hamas in Gaza Strip. And it's interesting because, and this is the major point I need to emphasize, is because the fact that in the Arab world, and including the Palestinian, they hold Hamas accountable. They say to Hamas, you govern Gaza Strip and you're responsible for what happened to Gaza Strip. And so I think that it's important to bring that notion to the center of the discussion in the West. Why? Because unfortunately, the exemption of Hamas from accountability as a governing power actually played to the hands of Hamas and ironically and tragically, basically sabotaged and damaged the Palestinian people and the Israelis as well. By accepting Hamas from responsibility, one of the things that happened was that Hamas continued to market the slogan of the resistance, and under this banner continued to drag Gaza Strip into destruction and havoc already before October 7, let alone, of course, after October 7. And by accepting Hamas from responsibility, I have been talking about today about this issue of the resistance and how enormously it has destroyed parts of the Middle East, large parts. By accepting Hamas from responsibility, basically, it has boosted Hamas at the expense of the Palestinian people who do not comply with the issue of the resistance. And so I think that it's enormously significant to bring that to the discussion. Yet again, I want to emphasize, I'm not a spokesperson, and my job, the way I see it, is to provide the wider context so we can understand the ins and outs of what's going on in the region, and particularly to bring the aspects that are absent from the Western discussion, particularly vis-a-vis the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Take another question. Rosalie, if you could unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. One thing I just wanted to say first is just that I tried to type it in the chat, but it says the chat is disabled, so I couldn't type. And I want to thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to ask questions. And my question is about this, about the, I have a, hard time talking about the hostage agreement. And if I'm concerned that letting all of the prisoners out of jail will cause a bigger problem down the line. But yet I also feel that Israel stands strong in showing how committed we are to bringing back every person alive, and also our dead to be buried with their families in Israel. And so my question is what will happen with the big number of releases if it continues as it does, and will this bring peace ultimately? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your question. You are actually accurately reflecting a very, emotionally, politically debate within Israeli public opinion vis-a-vis the whole issue of the price that Israel is required to pay for the release of the hostages. There are a couple of thousands of Palestinians that are imprisoned in Israel, and they have been indicted at courts for being involved in terror attacks, and that's the reason why they are imprisoned in Israel. Now, some of them are people that are described as architects of massive terror plots and attacks that resulted in the killing of many, many Israelis. This is what is called people with blood on their hands. It's very clear that Hamas is demanding the release of those peoples as well as many others. And it goes back, as you said, to the issue of the price involved. And as you accurately say, many Israelis are saying, look, you release those people who has been involved in killing Israelis, they will go back to terror. And that, of course, will result in the escalation of a circle of violence and so on, which is very correct. I'm saying it as a fact because in previous experience, particularly if you may recall, of course, the deal of the release of the abducted Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit. Israel released more than 1,000 Palestinians that were imprisoned in Israel, and one of them was Yahya Sinwar, the architect of October 7 attack. So this is, of course, very valid concern. On the other hand, as you accurately mentioned, the Israelis are saying, in the end of the day, first and foremost, we must bring back our brothers and sisters, the hostages, at all price, at all cost. And so you definitely touch a very painful and sensitive issue that, of course, is today in the center of discussion of Israeli public opinion. As of the concept of peace, I'll take the opportunity to say very shortly, look, I think it's, as I've been saying it for many years in my different positions and capacities, I wrote about it and I said that, and I wish I could say that I was wrong, but up until now, I was very right. The whole issue of peace is irrelevant, and this is not a political statement. It's an observation, a professional observation of the very fact that both Israelis and Palestinians are not in a place where they can sit down to the table and really start the process that could lead to a real peaceful solution. They are not, and particularly not following October 7. So peace is irrelevant in that regard. What is relevant today, and going back to my presentation tonight, explaining to you the wider picture, I think it's relevant today to talk about and to expect realistically for the possibility of much more proactive regional involvement by players in the Arab world that I mentioned before, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and others, that could help building scaffoldings that will enable Israelis and Palestinians in a very gradual, modest and moderate process to move from one scaffolding to another. I'm not talking here about big jumps. I'm not talking about peace. I'm talking about realistic, painful process, hopefully leading towards some more positive trajectory. And we should be looking at reality face value on both sides, Israelis and Palestinians. We should understand the inner challenges and obstacles and narratives and discussions within both sides. We should understand the way it's reflected in the inner political system of both sides. So we will be able to evaluate realistically the odds of that trajectory or another trajectory. Basically, what I'm saying here, we must adopt a realistic, cold mind, sort of speaking, analysis of the reality, of the many moving part of that reality. So we'll be able to set a reasonable, achievable bar and not something that is not achievable. Peace, the way Western mind is looking at currently, is not relevant and not in the foreseeable future.
We will take one more question.
Thank you for your presentation. I heard an Israeli speaker a couple of days ago predict that there is a high probability that phase 2 and 3 of the ceasefire may not move forward because of threats of the right wing of the Israeli parties. What's your thought about that?
Well, as I said before, there is definitely a probability that we'll see a reignition of violence, and maybe something that will stop, the whole process. Look, there are a couple of factors at work here that are kind of like contradicting from different directions. So it's very difficult to try to understand where things are leading to. As I said before, we could definitely not, unfortunately, exclude the possibility that the whole process will collapse. This is a very possible scenario. I'll try to lay out very shortly the different powers that are involved here. Let me start with the Palestinian side. Hamas launched October 7. We talked about the reason and what led to that. And Hamas obviously now is struggling with a serious criticism, even though, as I said before, there are also the voices that continue to talk about, by the way, Hamas is marketing triumph. Some people in the Arab world and Palestinians are subscribing to that narrative. Many others are totally not, basically saying to Hamas, what triumph exactly are you talking about? Gaza is destroyed and all the things that involve. So Hamas needs, in the end of the day, to have a tangible achievements. The major and perhaps maybe the only one, tangibly speaking, is the issue of releasing Palestinians prisoners. And so Hamas would, of course, try to exhaust that card as much as possible in order to come out and present this achievement, which will be viewed by Palestinians as an achievement. The question is, Palestinians are asking that, and Arabs are asking, okay, let's say that Hamas is releasing thousands of Palestinians, but was it worth the price? Open question. Just the same, Hamas will try to exhaust to the maximum that thing, meaning that he's going to conduct as much as he can a tough negotiations. On the other hand, Hamas facing on top of the whole challenges, now the people in Gaza are basically feel some sort of relief understandably, after 15 months of fight and war. I can tell you that now people in Gaza Strip are going back to what used to be their homes, but they don't exist anymore. And obviously people are devastated and there is a lot of anger, and there is a lot of depression. These people need answers, real answers to immediate needs of life. And so Hamas will find himself between the need to bring as much as possible release of Palestinians, but on the other hand, within the enormously increasing needs of the people of Gaza to have solutions, particularly once finally, after 15 months of terrible situation of a war, they have the ability or the chance to breathe a little. So here is an inner different power at plays that are basically playing a very significant role in the shaping of the path or the calculation of Hamas. On the Israeli side, we talked before about the issue of the inner Israeli public debate vis-a-vis the whole issue of releasing Palestinian prisoners. Indeed, as you mentioned, Israeli right-wing, ultra-right-wing political parties basically kind of like oppose a deal where, there will be a mass release of Palestinian prisoners. They demand the government to continue the war until the ultimate triumph, a term that I think was never really tangible and is not tangible, because as I said before, Hamas is not going to disappear. And so in the Israeli public opinion, once you got through the first phase and you see the 3 first female women that has been released with everything that comes along with it, there is a sense of deepening longing to see the rest of the brothers and sisters released and coming back to Israel. So again, you are looking at these different factors and actors that are very acute in the context of the Israeli perspective. And on top of that, we have to add the fact that we have a new administration in the States. Today was the inauguration of President Donald Trump, and he very clearly is very forcefully pushing towards concluding this whole situation. In other words, that the sides will conclude the negotiations and will end this thing. So we are looking at different factors, different pressures from different directions, and in such very fluid reality and circumstances and conditions, the scenario of reignition of the fight and collapse of the process is very realistic. It's not to say necessarily that that will happen, but it is indeed a scenario that we should look at it as a scenario that could be very realistic.
Well, we want to thank you, Avi, for your time. Very appreciated. I hope everyone enjoyed and learned a lot from this webinar. I personally found it very meaningful. So we will say good night now, Laila Tov, to everyone, and see everyone soon.
Laila Tov, thank you. Be well. Stay warm.